समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
After his attack on Venezuela, will Donald Trump take Greenland next? Well, Vice President J.D. Vance has said that the world had better take Trump's words seriously and that America is entirely serious about acquiring Greenland one way or the other. In fact, Trump has gone on record to say that whether it's military or money, the United States will have Greenland. Greenland has become today the center of geopolitical contestations, but it is perhaps one of the most discussed words right now in global discourse with very little actual knowledge about it. On the program today, we'll be cutting across to Australia, where one of the world's foremost experts on Greenland, the author of So You Want to Own Greenland, Elizabeth Buchanan, will be joining us. I'm Barkha. You're with the Mojo Story. Donald Trump needs to be taken both literally and seriously. Trump is now talking about acquiring Greenland one way or the other. The United States is talking about purchasing Greenland just as it did Alaska from the Russians so many years ago. Will there be military action or will there be financial coercion? The answers are not clear. Envoys of Denmark and Greenland have met at the White House this week. Very little is known about Greenland, 3 times the size of France with a population of just 57,000 people, which is somewhat comical for a densely populated country like India. We can't even imagine how such few people can actually basically change the course of modern global politics. But there it is. The Americans, of course, have a military presence in Greenland. But is this really about Washington's proxy war with both Moscow and China? I want to welcome on the program today one of the world's leading experts on Greenland. Her book, So You Want to Own Greenland, is a must read. I'm in the midst of reading it right now. It's accessible, it's brilliant, and it traces the history of Greenland. Thank you, Dr. Buchanan, for your time. Your book actually opens with exactly this formulation. Everybody's talking about Greenland. Very few people know anything about it. And going through everything you've said and written, you seem to say that there is logic in why the United States is eyeing Greenland. Trump is not the first American leader to do so. You document how Harry Truman once offered after the Second World War to purchase Greenland in $100 million worth of gold. So Trump isn't just being Trump here. The problem is, after what's happened with Venezuela, there is a sense that Trump could actually do this. How do you look at, first, before we get into your book, how do you look at the overall claims by Trump to get Greenland by hook or crook?
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I think it is so important that we inject some reality and some historical facts into the discourse that is Greenland. It is not lost on me how hilarious it is for a Greenland expert to be in Australia. You probably couldn't get further away unless you're in New Zealand. But I think with the distance comes a sense of perspective. So for me, as a polar geopolitical expert and watcher, I just look at a map, and that's what Donald Trump has done. Put aside the idea that, he is a grand strategic master and thinker and politician. He is not. He is a businessman first and foremost. So anybody looking at a map of the world, thinking about the Western Hemisphere, which we know Donald Trump will now prioritize for the US national interest, squarely puts Greenland at the heart of that theatre. So the idea that this is, as you correctly underscore in your lead-in, the idea that this is somehow a concoction of the mind, that Trump has kind of woken up one morning and thought America will have Greenland. For me, it's a misreading of the facts on the ground. So we've had US military presence on Greenland for over 70 years. And this is something that, the Danes, but also Europe has requested, has supported, has relied upon. The US military footprint and the base there, the Badufik space base, is essentially the insurance policy for European security. It was the insurance policy, all of the sort of early warning radar systems and capabilities that are there, that are paid for paid for by the US, that are manned and staffed by the US, are monitored by the US. This is a situation that has origins in the Cold War. In fact, in World War II. So the idea that this is an unwelcome development in international politics, I think, is a fascinating thing to follow that discourse for a moment, because I think it speaks to how quickly the issue of Greenland came back on the radar so quickly after Venezuela, because I think it was the sheer shock of things. This, seems like a gamble. It seems like an odd grab for the Trump administration. But for me, it's pragmatic policy for any US leader when it comes to Greenland. And in my book, I unpack, I guess, the historical issues that are there with Greenland and with Denmark. And, the Danish government still treats Greenland as a colony. It might not do it in name. It is referred to as a self-autonomous, semi-independent territory of the Danish kingdom. But in reality, when you are underwriting an entire community's, ecosystem and livelihood, your schools, your hospitals, your pensions, that's coercive. It is up to the Greenlandic people, first and foremost, to decide their fate. And that, I think, is getting missed in the discourse right now. It is not about Trump abandoning Europe. It is about Trump putting pressure on the Danes to pull forward this discussion about Greenlandic independence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'll come to the history of Greenland, the fact that there is a long history of colonization from the Vikings to the Danes in a moment. And your book is a very important chronicle of that. But just to pick up on contemporary politics, one of the points that you have made, and this speaks to Trump being a pragmatic businessman first and foremost, is not just the security importance of Greenland to the United States of America, but also critical minerals. And I think you wrote that the critical mineral reserves in Greenland may be so voluminous that it would help America overtake China if America were to get control of these minerals. So let's also understand, and you're the best person to explain this to us, Greenland in the context of the G2 or the G3 world that Trump imagines, where the two great powers will be America and China, maybe to a lesser degree Russia. I want you to explain Greenland to our audience in that context.
Yeah, so in the strategic kind of prize, if you can, about when it comes to Greenland, yes, we're talking about critical minerals, which, the ability to own the future of technology, to own the chip supply chain and development chain, but also the race for AI, right? So it's not just what's in the ground, which is very important, right? It's also in the Arctic Ocean region, in the offshore region of Greenland that reaches out under the North Pole. You've got vast hydrocarbons, so oil and gas, right? But beyond the critical minerals there on the actual Greenlandic ice mass, you have the basic geography of Greenland that is vastly populated, which you mentioned before, but it's also extremely cold. Now, if you think about all of the server farms, if you think about all of the computer power that you need to run the next generation of the AI race, right, for global data, the idea that you could set up or control mass amounts of server farms to give the computing edge for this next arc of strategic competition means that if you've got access to a vast vacant space that is Greenland, you develop modular nuclear technology, which we know the US is cracking on with. You can power these. You've got limited people that you can upset in terms of noise and output. So there's so many other aspects to this in terms of Greenland not only being a geostrategic prize, but also the resources that come with it. Another key resource is its proximity to what I would call the Panama Canal 2.0. So the issues that you have in the Panama Canal in South America are mirrored completely in the Arctic Ocean. So you have at one end the choke point in the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia, so the US and Russia, to enter the Arctic Ocean, thinking about how this new Arctic route will absolutely fundamentally change global transportation. It is cheaper. It is quicker to get goods from Asia to Europe. That is the future. India, we know, have cottoned onto that. So have the UAE. The huge DP world shipping firms are now working where they can along this new, Arctic sea route. But the other end, as per the Panama Canal, there's two ends to that choke point. You've got Alaska, but you've also got Greenland. If you think of the GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap. So you simply cannot allow, a window to open, which in the Western Hemisphere we know has been happening when it comes to Chinese presence everywhere. You cannot allow a window to open in which China can fill that vacuum and really, get presence, get boots on the ground and control one end of a choke point like the Arctic Circle. It might not matter in 5-10 years, the ice is still very thick. It's still an environmentally hazardous place to drill, to extract resources. But what Trump understands in his business-minded commercial sense of the world is it's not the 10-year game, it's the 25 to 50-year game. And that's where China is best at its, long-term diversification planning. And I think Trump has come in, had a look at a map and realized that what was the American century or unipolar moment is over. So how do you prolong that?
So what you describe is a set of very good reasons why Trump would be interested, or the United States would be interested in Greenland. You also said this is not about Trump abandoning Europe, but it is also, there has to be pressure on Denmark to evaluate what the people of Greenland want. But how do you see the response of Europe? Europe has, in a somewhat feeble way, I would argue, issued a kind of statement that if the Americans do this, we will stand together. But the fact is that what has happened vis-a-vis Venezuela, what has happened with Trump now talking about possibly acting in Mexico, possibly acting in Iran, is that Trump is showing that he's not going to go by conventional norms of global negotiation, right? Do you see a military scenario unfolding in Greenland? What do you see? What do you foresee happening?
So I think it is absolutely the case that we can't take it off the table. I think anything's possible, but also the big takeaway, I think, from the discourse around European reactions and panic over the Trump statement, that is basically a confirmation of geography, is the idea that the US is the beacon, or has been long the beacon, of the liberal rules-based order, of which international law and norms are king, and there's clear lines, and they have essentially panicked over the fact that Trump has ripped up that rule book, and he's not asking for forgiveness. So we had also today JD Vance mention that there are, long-standing friends and allies and partners of the US, but that doesn't factor into their current considerations when they're looking at US interests in the world. And it's a case of, for Australia, I guess the big thing is, we have the US alliance as the cornerstone of our defense strategy. And we've just been woken up to the reality that if you don't pay your way, or if it is not beneficial for this cost-benefit analysis mindset of the US president, you will be left behind. So you mentioned the European statement, which was fascinating to read because it was, I think it was less than 8 US leaders actually put their names to this statement. And one that was missing was the Finns. Now, Finland, to not be on that statement was quite damning, considering they are one of the key Nordic powers, right? Traditionally and today. Of course, during the last 3 years of the Ukraine war, you've had Europe pivot away from Russian LNG to a complete reliance, 60% of all of Europe, on US LNG. But the Finns are 91% reliant on US LNG today. So, point is, Europe doesn't have any cards, and they know it. But in one breath, and this is also why I think Trump has acted in such a brash way as well, because he realizes that Europe has no leverage. Now, Europe is faced with a two-front war right now. They are desperate and require US assurances for the Ukraine war peace deal, for any Ukraine solution. So on one hand, they are demanding that the US endorses and assures any, resolution on that front. But on the other hand, they're now saying, well, you couldn't possibly want to do anything with Greenland. So the dissonance is crazy, but also I think Europe is now awakening to this new normal. The Danes have been the Danish government have been very interesting with this issue, because any attention on Greenland as a problem and as a challenge is bad news for Denmark, because Denmark doesn't want to have to deal with the fact that it has in its own constitution the ability for the Greenlandic people to become independent. Now, there is, and my book goes through some fine print, it's very coercive. For instance, if the Greenlandic people hold a referendum, of which we know consistent polling shows overwhelming, and the current government in Greenland, the parliament in Greenland, are moving towards independence. So it's not a case of if we'll be independent, it's just when, right? The timeline, it has to happen. That's what the platform is. But the fine print in the Danish constitution and the amendment to do with Greenland is that any results of the referendum for independence must be approved by the Danish parliament. So why would the Danish government carve off its healthy leg? Greenland affords the Danish realm 95% of its territory just by sheer size. If you extend on the seabed resources, the geographical proximity, the history of Denmark basically saying to NATO and to the US, we give you free rent and use of Greenland, so we're not going to pay anymore because, So it's a difficult position for the Danes to be in, but also going internal to this issue and taking a step back from the global geopolitical issue of Greenland, there is a deep discussion that's underway in the domestic discourse between the Danes and the Greenlandic people. And there are Danish millennials, friends of mine, who are horrified that they still have basically a light colony that is treated this way. So it's an affront to, I guess, the Danish kind of Scandinavian values as well. So what Trump has done basically is lit a fire under a process that has been underway. And so now it's just a question of how this is resolved. And I see two ways for resolving this. Military might, sure. Military action could be something that Trump pulls out of the bag. But at the end of the day, the idea that Europe would then leave NATO is nonsensical, because NATO is the US, let's be honest. But also, people forget that the Danes only have one helicopter and, less than 100 people.
They have only one helicopter.
Right,
they have one helicopter on Greenland.
And they also have, I think it's 16 dog sleds. So, they could try, but also in a serious comment, everything that the Danish army and the military industrial complex has is US kit. They've just signed off on ordering F-35s. They've just ordered P-8 Poseidons. Everything that most of the European armies have, from machine guns to helmets to extreme weather gear, is coming from the US. So I think we need to be serious that that won't be something that will be forced upon the region in terms of a firing conflict over Greenland. And as I said, Europe is wedged. So you've got leaders, you've got Macron, who is now talking about, having to break away basically and accept the fact that the US is quote unquote trashing the international rules-based order. So what Europe does in response, I think, is it's got limited options, but Greenland, I think, will be currently having some really interesting bilateral discussions with the White House as to what their demands are. Essentially, it might be a monetary figure. But I do think the priority for the Washington elites right now is to cut the Danes out of this discussion, and quick. Which you wouldn't have much pushback.
And basically talk directly to Greenland and to the people of Greenland.
Yes.
So I have a question there. While I understand that most people in Greenland would lean towards independence if there was a genuine referendum, and therefore there is a history of colonization vis-a-vis Denmark. Given the resource reality check, given how few people Greenland has, even an independent Greenland would need a greater power to sustain as an autonomous country. And that would then be either Europe, as has been, or the Americans. And what you're suggesting is that there is no future of Greenland without American patronage or patronage from one of the other great powers.
Absolutely, but who else will step in? It's quite clear that China and Russia have now been persona non grata, so they're not about to step in, right? Greenland, the Greenlandic people, especially the politicians, they have become quite adept at playing mum off against dad when it comes to the Danes or Europe and the US to get a good deal. I do think we would see, you're correct, any independence for Greenland would require and does require economic security, underwriting, but also sustainability. So yes, it sits upon resources. Yes, it could unlock its geographical position. It could start, leaning into ecotourism. It has all these opportunities. But at the end of the day, of 57,000 people, you have quite a large youth population who are homeless. Alcoholism is an issue. Drug use is an issue. Unemployment is rampant. So I'm a mum, and I did a lot of field work with parents in Greenland to try and understand what they wanted. What future do you want for your children? Because that's what brings us together, I think, as mums globally, right? You want something better than what you had. You want assurances. And the idea, this is where the Compact of Free Association probably does come into play here, of which they get to culturally keep their heritage, the Inuit traditions. They can be a sovereign, independent state, but they have defense and foreign policy protection from the US, but the US also gets what it needs, which is an insurance policy on its doorstep. But a Compact of Free Association also allows for the Greenlandic people to freely work, travel, and study in the US. So those were the opportunities that I think people are underplaying in the general discourse, that I know the Greenlandic people would be pushing for.
Okay, I have a last question on the future of NATO, but since you did mention JD Vance, let me quickly play out his latest comment, which is basically urging the world, do believe us when we talk about our interests and our determination to actually take control of Greenland. Let's take a look, and I'll come right back.
Thank you. On Greenland, do you have a message for European leaders? Many in Europe reject the idea that the island could be for sale.
Well, first of all, Secretary Rubio, I believe, is meeting with the leaders of Denmark and Greenland next week, I want to say it is, but maybe it's the week after that. We'll continue to deliver some of these messages in private, some of them in public, but I guess my advice to European leaders and anybody else would be to take the President of the United States seriously. What has he said about Greenland? Set to the side the crazy overreactions that I've seen from the press and from certain people in Europe. What has the President said? Number one, Greenland is really important, not just to America's missile defense, but to the world's missile defense. Number two, we know that there are hostile adversaries that have shown a lot of interest in that particular territory, that particular slice of the world. So what we're asking our European friends to do is to take the security of that landmass more seriously, because if they're not, the United States is going to have to do something about it. What that is, I'll leave that to the president as we continue to engage in diplomacy with our European friends and everybody on this particular topic. And again, thank you all for listening.
Okay, so that's very specific. Take the American president seriously. Also interesting that Denmark and Greenland mentioned as two separate entities when it comes to talks with the White House, which goes to your point. What, just finally, is your sense now of Europe? You've already said has no leverage. What does that mean for a military alliance like NATO? Does it make it almost irrelevant, or fully sort of co-opted by America? And two, what do you see happening?
So first of all, on the NATO point, what has been fascinating is I think the split within NATO of those states who are happy to kind of step back and let the French, and I think even Starmer, the UK, have tried to come out and show some European leadership here on the utility and the integrity of keeping NATO together. But others have kind of sat quietly and have in backroom discussions pointed out the fact that NATO isn't operating right now. It's not functioning. They've had 12 months now since Donald Trump first flagged the idea of taking Greenland, which the Danes could have used as a verbal threat, could have used under the conditions of the Washington Treaty Article 4, which says any member state that feels threatened or the territorial integrity feels threatened can call a meeting, a summit, and let's talk about it. That hasn't happened, right? And so I think the reality here is NATO is showing itself to be somewhat of a paper tiger, because what could it actually do? Correct. And again, going back to the requirements for ending this atrocious conflict in Ukraine, that is more of a priority for Europe than Greenland. And I think it's okay to own that and just for face value say that that's also how the US feels. So the sense I have of Europe at the moment is it is about to start realizing much more fundamentally just how this administration in the US will be operating going forward, and that while Europe was a great partner and is a great ecosystem and market for the US, it is very much a transactional relationship going forward, and it is not a priority. The Western Hemisphere is now Washington's priority. So there are some hurt egos, I think, but I think there's also a bit of a scramble as to what that means, because strategic autonomy in Europe is something that these elites don't understand. So it has, I think, hastened, this whole Greenland issue has hastened a discussion about strategic autonomy, but it's also hastened a discussion about the international order. And perhaps it had shifted to a multipolar, order under the Biden era, or at least in the last 12 months. And, the liberal West have had their blinders on.
Absolutely.
Rules for thee, but not for me. So there's some hard discussions, I think, that need to be had in Europe. We need to have them in Asia as well. I know my government's avoiding those discussions, but I don't think this is an aberration of Trump. I think what comes after Trump is very much set in this transactional, realpolitik mindset. And we can't control that. We don't have the ability to control that. So as states in this ecosystem, all we can do is go inside and figure out what our national interests are, what our non-negotiables are, and, we have to coexist. But strategic autonomy might be the name of the game.
Well, that's something that India has embraced, but India is going through a very, very tense, I would say, fraught phase of relations with the United States of America. So I think every country is negotiating this from their own lens, as it were. I just want to say, before we say thank you to you, that there was a tweet out on X from one of, I think it was US Department of Labor, or one of the official American institutions, saying globalism is over, Americanism is here. And I think that, and I found that so telling that I think, as you said, liberal Western elites had blinders on about what kind of world we had entered, and Trump has just come and said, hello, wake up, smell the coffee. This is the real world.
And you know what? I think that's helpful, right? As my millennial generation comes in to receive this world from the boomers. But that is the world as it is, probably maybe not as, it's not what we wanted or what, we had crafted for ourselves. But what's going to be really interesting to watch in our neck of the woods is going to be the Quad, because for the last 10 years, we've had Australia and the US kind of needling India to get off the fence. And now it seems that the US is building its own fence. So, maybe there are some lessons from how India is still trying to navigate and grow in this international order. And it's humbling for other countries.
And no easy answers. It actually speaks to sort of that Darwinian concept of hard power and capacity. It kind of all boils down to that, but we leave it there. As fascinating as this has been. Elizabeth Buchanan, the author of So You Want to Own Greenland. I recommend the book highly. I'm going through it at this moment. It is a very, very interesting read, and it really does explain so much about why Trump, and not just Trump, many American leaders before him have had their eyes set on Greenland. Thank you, ma'am. And we look forward to connecting with you again.
Again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.